turn to Proverbs 13, 14, 15, somewhere in the middle. You'll be kind of right there where a bulk of them are. Today, as we continue our summer approach to learning what does Solomon say to us through the book of Proverbs, we talk about what does the book of Proverbs say about charting a course of lifelong or of long-term spiritual growth. Not one built on mountains and valleys and plateaus, but rather just a consistent climb up the mountain of spiritual growth. To kind of set the stage for what I want us to walk away with today, I'm going to turn to my trusty whiteboard over here, and I'm going to kind of draw an illustration, and you're going to learn. First, there's a reason why I was not an art major in college, but hopefully this will also help us see kind of what I'm after. As I've experienced personal spiritual growth, and also as a pastor, as I've dealt with hundreds of people trying to figure out what does developing a relationship with Jesus look in their own lives, I found we all too often tend to fall into this pattern of growth spurts and then growth slowdowns and then growth declines. And again, this is just a very natural pattern. And so we may start out here with kind of our starting point when we begin that relationship with Him. Some of us did that at 8 years old. Some of us maybe did that at 60 years old. And where or at what phase of life, we don't necessarily have to discuss that today. We just need to recognize we've got a starting point of when we began a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And often, we kind of soar up from there. There's a lot of new energy. And eventually, for whatever reason, that kind of trails off a bit. And what I do believe is, in spiritual terms, you never stay still. You're either growing and moving forward, or the day you stop that, you begin to decline. So once you plateau, I've got a line there. I don't really think there's a line necessarily. I think you just start to immediately decline. And then something happens. Maybe a spiritual event. Maybe some sermon gets your attention. And so you spike up again. And then again, maybe that lasts for a good long while. But in time, maybe that wears off and you kind of drop back down, and then maybe a life event happens. Maybe it's the birth of a child or a marriage, and that heightens your spiritual awareness, so you spike back up. Okay? But then maybe something happens and you really take a decline. And this pattern can just kind of go on until the end of our life. Now, is that bad? I can't say it's bad because there's still growth here. But what I will say is I think there's a preferable model. That instead of being dependent upon spiritual growth happening in this kind of flash and back off way, I think we just need to set this very steady but very consistent pattern of spiritual growth that just ticks away over the course of time and eventually gets us further than this kind of sprint and jog then walk pattern of spiritual growth. Now, what I'll also say, if we chart this consistent thing, there'll be times to where you speed up a bit. You'll hit the gas. That birth of a child will maybe reignite. Maybe a job change will reignite. Maybe a crisis point will cause you to pay extra attention to your faith and your relationship with Him. And at that point, it's like you hit the gas and you take off up. But the key is you don't come back down. The key is we don't relax that spiritual energy. So it's this model today that we're trying to figure out how we get there. It's this line of just continual, consistent, not going anywhere fast, but always making progress that I hope we will all walk away with going, that's what I need to aim for in my life. And also, we'll look at three groupings of thoughts from Proverbs that says, and that's a little bit how we get there. Now, it would take me a year to go through everything the Bible says about developing just a consistent pattern of spiritual growth. So we're not going to answer all of it today, but I do think Proverbs teaches us three things today that we can walk away with and begin to put into practice this coming week. The first kind of key thought I want us to think on is that if we want to chart this pattern of lifelong or of long-term spiritual growth, we need to choose our influencers wisely. We need to choose your influencers wisely. So we need to be very, very careful who we allow to have a lot of impact over our life, who we allow to really shape how we think and feel and behave and believe, because they are going to make a tremendous impact on which direction we go spiritually. A verse I want us to read comes from Proverbs chapter 13, verse 20, and it says, "The man who walks with the wise will become wise, but a companion of fools will suffer harm." Now that's very simple, and it seems rather obvious, but it is so true. Here Solomon articulates the eternal principle that you become like the people you hang out with. You become like the people you spend time with. And you become like the people who you allow to influence your life. And we don't outgrow this principle. Now, when I was in student ministry, we recognized how true this was. And the same was true when I did college and young adults. We recognized how true this was. That's why at every opportunity we talked to them about the friends they chose, because they were going to become like them. So if they developed friends with other Christians at either our church or another church, we knew they had a safety net at school of people to help them live out their faith. We also knew if they didn't, they were going to really struggle to maintain the stamina it took to live out their faith in an unwelcoming environment. But what I have found is I've worked with adults of older ages since my younger days in ministry, is that at every phase of life we still become like the people we spend the most time with. We don't outgrow this. That's why it's important we choose our influence so wisely. And one thing I read, and it just struck a chord, and I read it from a resource I was using, is that we don't always recognize that we're being influenced. And it kind of caused me to pause, and I go, oh my, that is so true. We don't always recognize that we are being influenced. One of my best friends now, he's always lived in Oklahoma. He's an optometrist in Oklahoma. We were together with our families about a year ago, and his wife looked at the both of us and said, "You two bring out the ornery in each other." We're like, "Whoa, what do you mean? We don't know what's going on," right? We don't always recognize that we're being influenced, but everyone around us does. So it's not always visible to us that we are becoming like the people that have the greatest ability to coach us or correct us in our lives, but everyone around us is knowing. Meaning, if we do this well, if we choose people who make a positive impact on our faith and who encourage that and who help us through that process and who pray us through that process, because of their influence, we'll make spiritual progress and not even realize it. But it will be very true that without unknowing, their influence is making a tremendous positive impact on our life and on the direction we're headed spiritually. We become like the people we hang out with. So we must choose our influencers wisely. A second verse that speaks to this comes out of Proverbs chapter 4, verses 14 through 15. Here King Solomon writes, "Keep off the path of the wicked. Don't proceed on the way of evil ones. Avoid it. Don't travel it. Turn away from it and pass it by." Solomon is just as clearly as he can, and again, he's writing this to his son. He is saying in every way possible, stay away from the people who are going to morally and spiritually drag your character down. You've got to avoid them. And when they start to come into your life, you've got to turn a different way. Now, in these few verses, Solomon uses phrases that would express the sentiment, don't go there. And he uses it 6 different times and in 6 different ways. Solomon, again, and we hit on this a bit last week, he refers to the path of wicked as this spiritual path that is pointing you in the wrong direction. And again, like we talked about last week, he uses the word wicked, but he doesn't use it like we often do when we reserve it for the most awful crimes or most egregious criminals. Solomon will say anything that does not directly point you closer to a personal relationship with Jesus and God's word and his way, then that's wicked. He draws a very clear line. It's either God's way or it's wicked. And Solomon is saying, don't allow yourself to be impacted by people who are not actively pointing you in the direction of a developing relationship with God. And he wants to so clearly get this point across that he says it 6 different times in two verses, hoping his son understands how intense Solomon is about this concept. Now think about it. If we were to, let's say someone was in the kitchen and they dropped a glass and it broke and it just went everywhere. And so let's say that you, being concerned, wanted to help, you ran into the kitchen, but you were barefoot or in sock foot. And so someone said, stop, don't come any further. Wait a minute, let me clean it up first. Hold on a second, come back in a minute. You would go, I got it. You don't want me coming into the room. And we would understand that by the so quickly use of those 6 different phrases that we weren't supposed to go any further. And we probably maybe would even be going, we could have just said that once. Didn't have to say it 6 times. I think the truth is about this is Solomon still understands that for his son and for us today, we need this encouragement more than 6 times in our own life. Because if we don't protect ourselves from influences that are going to drag down our faith, they will drag us down the wrong direction. So if we're going to chart a path of just continual spiritual growth, we've got to develop a team of people around us that support our faith in Jesus Christ, who also live out that relationship with him, who are going to encourage that verbally and with their actions, who are willing to be a supporting role in seeing us chart that continual path of spiritual growth. We've got to choose our group of influencers very, very wisely. Because even without us recognizing it, they're going to make a tremendous impact on the direction our faith heads. Now, I want to talk on 2 very practical points that apply to this concept of choosing our influencers so wisely. One is that we can't become isolationists. And what I mean by that is we've got to have relationships with people who do not share our faith. Because if we don't, the good news of a relationship with Jesus Christ won't spread. Right? If every believer everywhere at all times just huddled up exclusively with non-believers, with people who are not already professing believers in Jesus Christ, the spread of the gospel would stop. It wouldn't go any further. And that's not what God intends. So, don't mishear me as saying, well, you only spend time with people who support your faith. We develop relationships and we have relationships, or we keep relationships with people who don't support our faith, but we don't let them be the people who have the most access to speak into our lives. We've got to have relationships with those people. Because if nobody does, they don't have the opportunity to experience what we have spiritually experienced. But we can't give them a voice into our lives to the extent that they now have the opportunity to drag us down spiritually. So we're protective, but we're not isolationists. The second thing is, this is why Sunday school is so important. Because here at Wynwood, we have a built-in system that provides you with groups of people that are going to support your faith. This is why that every week, if you come to Wynwood for an hour, but leave after the worship service, or you come just before the first worship service, if you miss our Bible study hour, you're missing one of the best things our church has to offer. And I understand that many weeks that other hour is precious, especially when it's on your weekend and there's other things that you need to accomplish and there's chores to be done. I understand. But I'd also want you to catch that, man, this is one of the best hours of the week. Because you're going to get to open up the Bible once more. You're going to learn something. But just as important, you are surrounded by people who want to see you succeed spiritually. And we have groups that meet around different topics. We have groups that meet around their age range. So I'd strongly encourage you, if you came today and you're not planning to attend a Sunday school class afterwards, change your mind on that. Just give it a try. If you don't like it this week, you don't have to come back next week. But if you will give it a few weeks, I think you'll find it's really valuable to your life. And when we look at choosing our influencers wisely, ministries like Sunday school are a built-in way that our church offers to see you put yourself around people that want you to do well spiritually. Second key thought I want us to talk about today is that if we want to chart this long-term spiritual growth that we're focusing on, we need to be willing to accept God's loving correction. Proverbs 15:5 says, "A fool despises his father's discipline, but a person who accepts correction is sensible." Proverbs 15:31 through 33, so just a little further down the same chapter, says, "One who listens to life-giving rebukes will be at home among the wise. Anyone who ignores discipline despises himself, but whoever listens to correction acquires good sense. The fear of the Lord is what wisdom teaches, and humility comes before honor." We need to be willing to accept God's loving correction because doing so will serve us well spiritually. Now, the word discipline we'll talk about just for a bit because it's used in a lot of different ways. Okay, last year, the word discipline was a key part of our study last week, but we talked about more self-discipline. The same discipline it takes to watch your diet or to save money or to go for a walk instead of sit on the couch. Well, we talked about how we need to apply that same self-discipline to our spiritual life. And last week's theme was it's hard to live out biblical wisdom, and one of the reasons is because it requires a lot of just internal hard work of making ourselves do what the Bible teaches. And that really is tough work. Now, again, we see this word discipline this morning, but it's used in a different way. Last week it was self-discipline. Today we talk about the discipline of when God points something out to us that we are getting wrong. And that is not a comfortable process. Sometimes that's a rather painful process. And a lot of things come into play, and sometimes a lot of excuses come into play is why we don't want to accept God's loving correction. But if we're going to grow spiritually, we have to be willing to accept God's correction. I love how Solomon articulates this reality. He says that it is life-giving. God's correction is life-giving to our spiritual life. Think about our children as parents or your grandchildren. Some of the things we discipline over are to preserve their life, just their physical well-being. It's why we don't let our kids play in the street. It's why when I'm cooking dinner or when Gwen and I are in the kitchen, we don't let Eva walk up and play next to the stove because we know it could bring them physical harm. Now, sometimes we discipline for manners or for life skills, and that's important. Sometimes we discipline our earthly children because we just want to keep them alive. That is life-giving discipline for their physical life. Spiritually speaking, God disciplines us because he wants to breathe life into our relationship with him. He wants to preserve our relationship with him. He wants to see that thrive and be successful. And he sees things that we don't. Because he can look at my life, or he can look at your life and say, you're out of line here. Tim, you need to look at this area of your life because it does not line up with my character. Or Tim, you did that, or you said that, and you know that does not line up with what my word teaches. And you're out of step there. And it's a loving correction. Now, the word discipline or disciplinarian, that can conjure up a lot of different thoughts. Because maybe we had a parent or a coach or a principal that ruled with an iron fist, and it wasn't a loving correction, it was a mean correction. They just disciplined to prove that they could. God's not like that. God's not like that at all. We can accept his correction because it's good for us. We can accept his correction because we know it's going to pay off well for us spiritually. And we won't grow without it. If every time God points something out spiritually, we stiff-arm it, we'll put ourselves into one of these declines. Because obedience matters in spiritual growth. So if we're not willing to accept it, we just need to realize that we've said, I'm going to cap my own spiritual growth. Now, God disciplines in a lot of different ways. He has disciplined me as I have read my Bible, just in my own personal time. And I'm reading along. I'm not searching for anything specific, but a passage I read, God gets my attention. He says, you see what I said there? You didn't do that. And you need to make that right. God has disciplined me through the words of other people. Other people that loved me, other people who I gave the right to influence me, who would say, you're getting out of line here. And if you don't fix this, you're going to do harm to yourself. So he disciplined me through other people. He disciplines us in a variety of ways. And we almost always recognize when it's him. The question for us then becomes, are we willing to lovingly accept that or not? Lovingly accept it looks like, you know what, God, you're right. I did get that wrong. And we apologize to him. Sometimes that means we've got to go apologize to someone else. More than once I've had to go back and to say to someone else, I was completely out of line with what I did, and that had a negative impact on you. Now, I did not sin against them, but that was part of making it right in God's eyes. So we make our apology. We commit to God, okay, I don't want to repeat that mistake. So help me get it right next time. See, accepting God's discipline, it's not that complex. It's just hard to do. And this is similar to self-discipline, the fact that we have to choose whether or not we'll make ourselves do it. Because when God steps into our attention, or he gets our attention and says, you're out of line here, we've got a decision to make. Will we respond to that discipline and say, you're right, and I'm going to get that straightened out? Or will we say, I think I'll just do it my own way this time? But whatever decision we make in response to God's discipline is going to have a tremendous impact on whether we continue to grow spiritually beyond that, or whether we halt or cap our own growth because we're not willing to respond to God's correction on that point. So if we're going to chart a lifetime of spiritual growth, we have to respond to God's loving correction. The third thing is we need to strive for complete commitment. That we would look at all aspects of our life, all aspects of our thoughts, everything we feel, everything we do, and say, God, I'm going to give you complete control or complete access to this area of my life. I'm not going to push anything away in a corner and say, you can't touch this, this is mine. That we completely open up everything about us and say, God, I'm giving you full access to everything about who I am. And we mean it. Let's read Proverbs 16, 1 through 3. Again, this is what Pastor Brandon just read for us a bit ago. He said, the reflections of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. All of a person's ways seem right to him, but the Lord weighs motives. Commit your activities to the Lord, and your plans will be established. In those words, Solomon is speaking to a complete commitment to God, to God's Word, and a willingness to let God and His Word speak and change every aspect of our lives. And we need to make a commitment to God and to ourselves that that's the mentality we're going to have. That's going to be the condition of our mind and our hearts, that God, I'm not holding anything back from you. There's nothing you can't touch. There's nothing you can't speak to. And there's nothing I'm not willing to change should you point it out. And I think the reality is most of us can say those words. Most of us want to mean those words. I really think that. Problem is, a lot of us in the silence of our thoughts and in the silence of our heart really struggle to live out the full commitment to God in all areas of our lives. Now, we can live out a weak commitment, but that's not going to get us to where we want to go. Is it better than nothing? Yeah, sure. But it's still not going to help us obtain the level of the depth and the quality of the spiritual relationship that we want to achieve. We are very familiar with weak commitment. I remember a couple years ago attending a luncheon, church luncheon, and as staff, we were there to kind of play host. And it got to be time for the staff to go through the line. We helped serve and make sure everything was comfortable. And then it was our turn to eat whatever was left. And, well, let's phrase it like this. How many of y'all like dessert? Okay. Some of y'all are lying. Some of y'all aren't paying attention. All right. Most of us like dessert. But how many of you would say there are desserts that you can walk by and not take a piece? Sure. There are desserts you cannot walk by without taking a piece. Okay, for Father's Day, Gwen made me a pecan pie. I can't walk by that without taking a piece. All right, Tuesday I went home for lunch. She looked down at the pie and said, "You've really made some progress." I thought, don't sass me. Notice I didn't say it. All right? There are desserts we can walk by. There's desserts we just can't walk by. I'm going through the line with another one of the pastors, and I knew he was trying to watch his diet a little bit more, and so was I. And there were like cookies, brownies, and Jell-O cake. Now, I'm going to say out front, I like Jell-O cake. I really do. In fact, now that I've said it, there's a good chance I'm going to make some in the next week and eat it. But it is also a dessert I can walk by without taking a piece. Like if I decide I'm not going to eat dessert today and it is served, I can typically say no to that. So I'm walking through with this other pastor and he goes, "Man, I told myself all morning long I wasn't going to eat dessert, but there's Jell-O cake." I'm going, you just really aren't committed to this not eating dessert thing today, are you? We have levels of commitment to different things in our lives. Same's true spiritually. At some level, most of us can commit some of our thoughts to God, some areas of our lives to Him. Most of us can give some level of access to God over our lives. Maybe it's 20%, maybe it's 40%, maybe it's 60%. And wherever we are today, I'm glad we're there spiritually. But we also need to understand that if we want to further develop our relationship with Jesus Christ, we've got to be able to raise the level of commitment that we give him. Or we're just going to stall out where we're at. Hey, if we're at 80%, 90% commitment, if we'll give God access to 90% of our lives, but not this other 10, that's great that you're there. But even at that level, if you want to continue to grow, you're going to have to find a way to say, God, I'm going to give you this other 10% of my life. And that may be your habits, may be your pocketbook, it may be your schedule, it may be a preference. I don't know what it is. It's probably a little bit different for every one of us. But we've got to be willing to look at the areas of our lives that we try to make inaccessible to God and say, God, I want to give you access to this. And many times we're going to say, but I'm going to need your help to figure out how to let you impact this area of my life that I have previously tried to keep out of your reach. We want to continue growing spiritually over the course of our lifetime. We're going to have to develop the habit of continually giving God greater access to who we are, how we think, what we feel, what we believe, how we make decisions, all of those. And many other areas that I could have listed off as well. We want to continue to chart and make spiritual progress. We're going to have to develop the habit of continually giving God a little bit more access to our lives every single day. Right. Most of us, as we came into Dave's, as we thought about spiritual growth, lifelong spiritual growth, I think we all probably said, that's a good thing. I would like to accomplish that in my life. Well, as we work through today, we realize sometimes doing that are built on very simple concepts. Things I talked about today, they're not overly in-depth. They're very easy to wrap our minds around doing, but they're still things we have to step out and do if we want to see ourselves develop spiritually. We've got to choose wisely the people we give the greatest influence in our lives. We've got to be willing to accept God's loving correction and accept it when we step a bit out of bounds and allow him to get us redirected on that path that'll lead to spiritual growth. And we've got to be willing and got to be able to continue to at least try to give God a little bit more access to our life every single day. Let me say a word of prayer, and then Miss Jackie and Miss Carol will come up. God, we thank you so much for today and what you're doing in our lives. And God, I thank you for our time together this morning and the opportunity we had just to open up your word and to see what it says about our lives. And God, I pray that as we finish this time, as we start a new week, that we would remember the things that you tried to point out. And God, if there's some sort of adjustment or correction you need us to make in our lives to continue to grow, I ask that you would help us to see that and be willing to act on that. Just help us to continue to give us our full attention to you over the next few minutes, and be with us as we think on these things and then move on towards a new week. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Would y'all please stand?